Today, the Uniting Church is 40 years old. If one assumes the normal average lifespan of most people, of let's say 80 plus, then the Uniting Church is in now midlife crisis. I don't normally quote statistics very much because I remember a friend of mine who, as a Methodist minister, was appointed to a little Methodist chapel in a tiny English village. He had a congregation of 4, and they were a lovely bunch of 4 people, and there were 2 churches in this village. There was the Methodist church at this end of the village, and there was the Anglican church at this end of the village, which also had a congregation of 4. And they, pottered along for a few years, and my friend arrived there as the minister, inherited the impressive congregation of 4, and then one day, one of the ladies in the Anglican church, a very forthright and you can imagine loud-speaking lady, had a row with the vicar. And she left the Anglican church and made great play one Sunday morning of charging down the one street in this village, leaving the Anglicans and joining the Methodists, thereby increasing his congregation to 5. He was very pleased with that, and he was even more pleased a couple of months later when he got a letter from the statistical department of the Methodist Church of the United Kingdom, which said that with a 25% increase in his congregation, he was the fastest growing church in the country. And they wanted to know how he'd done it. Well, so let's not be too impressed with statistics, but nevertheless, let's consider for a moment the latest census figures in Australia. The Uniting Church is declining at a rate of 5% every 5 years. And adding to that the age of most congregations, this new and exciting church, celebrating its 40th birthday today, will, if one goes on that same trend, go out of existence in less than 40 years hence. The other denominations are pretty much the same, with the Anglicans suffering the biggest actual decline in numbers. It was the psychologist Elliot Jacks who coined the phrase 30 or 40 years ago, midlife crisis, referring to a time when adults reckon with their own mortality and the remaining years of their life. So, it's a good time then to reflect today on what appears to be the decline of our institutional church. And as we do that, just think for a moment about our own life in this same process. Do it side by side. It was Professor Daniel Levinson from Harvard who developed what he called the seasons of life theory. And in it, he categorized 7 different aspects and stages of life, which we can apply to the church as well as ourselves. So, as we just reflect on these stages, think about the stages in our own life, because we've all pretty well been there. What he called, first of all, early adult transition, 17 to 22. Within these early years, decisions are being made. This is typically the decisions about going to university or developing a trade or how you are relating to your friends as they develop. The second stage he called entering the adult world. This is the 22 to 28 stage. More concrete decisions are made, occupations are determined, friendships, values, and lifestyles developed. This happened to our church and to ourselves. The third stage was transition, the 28 to 33 year period. Often significant lifestyle changes are made, including marriages, partnerships, children, and they all bring with them a range of different consequences. Stage 4, 33 to 40 years. Life is settling down a bit. Routines are established, goals are being set for the future, and we begin to behave like an adult. This is the time of conformity and conservatism. This is the stage that the Uniting Church has been going through over the last few years. And we look to the few years ahead, what Levinson calls midlife transition, the 40 to 45. And oh yes, this is often the time of crisis. I bet there's a whole lot of people here today who will look back on that time and say, yes, I remember that went wrong in my life at that time. That was a very significant, critical point for me. And when that happens, lives are being reevaluated. This is the most common period of divorce and separation and partnerships breaking. Values can change. This applied to the church. It's so then important to think about that, to apply to our church now. The next stage, middle adulthood, the 45 to 50 period. This is the time when we're making those big choices about the future and possible retirement. In the church, this could be the time when we're making excuses as we see the decline and end of what might be the conclusion of the Uniting Church as it reaches towards the end of its useful period. And then the 60-plus period that Levinson calls late adulthood. This is the time, he says, when we reflect on life and decisions that we've made in the past. But I would want to say, this is the time for us for serious decision-making about the future. And it is even a time for new beginnings. So you see that story that we read, the laborers in the vineyard. There was no difference between the people who'd been there all day and the ones that just came in at the end. It is, for me, I reckon, a message for us all today. And as we look to the future of the church, the Uniting Church we're thinking about today, when it gets to that period, if it still exists, well, it can look after itself. What I'm most concerned about is where we are individually and where we're going in this church as we look towards that period ahead of us. When the Uniting Church was born in June 1977, Dr. Davis McCarthy, and many of you will remember him as a governor of Victoria, a Uniting Church minister, and he effectively was one of those early midwives of the uniting church. And as he looked into that baby of the uniting church on that first day when he declared its existence, he preached a sermon at that first service with these 3 points. He said, what's most important of all is the fundamental question, much more important than church unity, he says, because it will come to nothing unless you reflect on where you come from, who you are, and where you're going. So let's ask those questions now, 40 years on. Where do you come from? We ask it of the uniting church. It's important. Ask it of ourselves. Just think of our own parents, our grandparents, our families, the people that have effectively molded our life up to this point. Where do we come from, and where does the church come from? Because without them, we would not be here. Well, the Congregational Union, which is represented by this church here, came from the spirit of the Puritans. Men like John Bunyan, John Milton, and Robert Brown, who stood very strongly up to the orthodoxy of the Church of England and fought for an independent spirit. That independent spirit we still claim. We haven't given it up. It's still very much part of St. Michael's here. And they took it to the USA and then around the world, where eventually it arrived in Australia and to Melbourne in 1837, when the Collins Street Independent Church was born. Another of its parents, of course, was Methodism, itself a product of Church of England priests, John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Charles Wesley. They couldn't stand the conformity and the irrelevance of the Church of England establishment. And Methodism was born in the late part of the 18th century, combining evangelical fervor with social justice, with passion, addressing the huge issues of the day of poverty and disadvantage. The third parent, of course, was the Presbyterian Church, owing its birth to the giant legal and theological figures of John Calvin and John Knox. Its history of strong organization, education, and pastoral care continues right through to the present uniting church. So that's where we're from. That's the first question. The second question was asked, well, that's where we're from. Well, who are you? So we think about the church as it is now. And whilst we're doing that, we think about our own lives here today. The uniting church is a strange middle-aged character. Using Levenson's theory of midlife, I would want to say, rather than midlife crisis, midlife transition. That's a bit more positive. Well, if you look at the uniting church, it looks pretty much like a church, doesn't it? Ask people walking by today out there and you say, well, what's the uniting church? And if they know at all what you're talking about, and many of them will, they'll say, well, here's a picture of the uniting church. I don't know if you saw that very well-known Rowan Atkinson sketch when he goes into church and he barely keeps awake. He has to hold his eyes open like this as the vicar, presume what I'm doing now, as the vicar drones on boringly. and speaking a whole lot of irrelevant relevances, whilst he has trouble with outdated hymns and the accepted but totally irrelevant customs of the church. If you go beyond that and you say to people in the street, tell us about the church, they'll say, well, it's a place where weddings take place, isn't it? I remember going to a wedding in that church, they might say, 10 years ago, where funerals take place, where christenings happen. They'll describe boring sermons and adherence to outdated concepts as they'll talk about their literal view of the Bible and how stupid that is and think that we within the church hold that view. They'll understand the church God as one of judgment, detached from the world, but somehow pulling the strings on its behavior. And they might assume a catalogue of very conservative and reactionary policies, such as the church's view on sexuality. Well, this is what the church looks like to them. This is what it is. If that's what it looks like to the majority of people in the census, and they are in the census the majority of the people outside the church, and they are on the increase whilst the church is on decline. If that to the unchurched ordinary people outside the stained glass windows of the church is what it looks like, that's what it looks like, but it's not quite what it is it? I remember when I was a young bloke, my dad, who after he retired from the police force, took on a senior position in what was called the Retired Police Officers Association, and he represented retired policemen everywhere, and he had to go to lots of meetings all over the place. And when he was getting on a bit, he really couldn't drive very far. So if I was home from uni or whatever, and I was able to drive him, I would. And I remember he was at some big meeting at some big police centre. I think it was Scotland Yard, and I drove him there. And I just had to hang around for a couple of hours waiting for the meeting to finish. And I was a university student, unshaven, long hair, jeans, T-shirt, the usual uniform. And I was just hanging around, walking about, and a policeman came up to me from this very same place, as it happens. And he said, "Excuse me," he said, "can you help us in our inquiries?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, we're having an identity parade, and we're looking for people to join the identity parade." Have you ever wondered about that when you see that on the movies, where they get the people from? Well, they just go out in the street and ask them. And I was one of them they asked. And I went into the ID parade. And I'm standing there alongside about 6 or 7 other blokes, and right in the middle, of course, is this scruffy bloke who is the guy that they brought in, who was the guy that they thought was the accused. So I'm standing there, and then after a few minutes, they bring in a couple of other people to look at us, right? Up and down the line, see? And they stop and look, and then they move on to the next one. And then the policeman said to the person, "Can you just tap the person on the shoulder who you think you saw?" They tapped me. You wouldn't believe it, would you? Yes. So anyway, everybody was scuttled out. I got apologized to, and I got a cup of tea and a biscuit. And it reminded me very much that this clearly got it wrong, right? Maybe I did look like a criminal, I don't know. But that wasn't the intention. So just think about it for a moment. Sometimes what people think of the church, like people thought something of me, is not actually what it is, and it's certainly not what it should be. When we look at the Uniting Church, well, there's a few good things about it. The Uniting Church has a good record on developing a ministry which values the gifts of all men and women, and raise the role of women in the church beyond many, many other churches. Its reconciliation process with our first peoples has been a good one. It's maintained a strong position in supporting refugees and asylum seekers. And the decisions that it makes within its councils across the board are both open and inclusive. That's good. But it's not really ball-grabbing, is it, really, when you think about it? Because you see, when I look at the church to which I belong, I see a church consumed with process before action. I see a church with an emphasis on guilt. I see a church lacking vision and dynamism. I see a church slow in decision-making. I see a church with an outdated theology and liturgy. I see a church like Rip Van Winkle sleeping through the revolution, which will wake up too late. I don't see a church consumed with fire and passion. I don't see a church taking risks. I don't see a church of dynamism and vision. I don't see a church challenging the orthodoxy and the political climate like our forebears did. And I don't see a church with a future. This is the 500th year since the Reformation, when Martin Luther hammered on the door of Castle Church, Wittenberg, his declaration of belief, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Where are we hammering? I don't know. And so we reflect on where we came from, which is good. We reflect on who we are, and then we think about where we're going. To go anywhere, you need vision. You need to see where you're going. It goes without saying that the church, our church, needs vision. Too long has the church preferred to look down at the pavement and just mooch along, bumping into stuff from time to time. We need to look up and see what's ahead of us, what's around us. We need to be a visionary church to see where we're going. And visionaries have a number of characteristics that we need to grab hold of. We need, firstly, to be creative. We need to start to look outside the square. We need to shake off the fetters of convention. And we need to look to new and unusual ways of getting things done. I remember on one occasion I was organizing a sponsored cycle event for people with visual difficulty and people who were blind. And it was a fundraiser for people who couldn't see. And then I got a request from somebody who was totally blind to see if they could take part in the event. Now, how could somebody who wasn't able to see ride a bike? And it occurred to me that one way of doing that was to make an appeal. This was when I was in Scotland, to make an appeal across the whole country for tandems. And we got 100 tandem bicycles offered to us, which meant that people who were blind could sit on the rear of a tandem And a sighted person could able, therefore, to enable the person who couldn't see to take a full and active part in that cycle ride, to be able to feel the air rushing across their face and their hair blowing in the wind, to be part of the event. It just needed a different way of looking at things, a bit of creativity. Visionaries are not afraid to fail. Visionaries take risks and are not scared off by a monumental task or terrified by the prospect of getting it wrong. Visionaries recognize that risk is part of the adventure of progress and that failure is but a stepping stone to perfection. So much so, our church just fails to do that. It's all too difficult and too hard and too dangerous, and it might not work, and we did it once and it didn't work, and all that sort of stuff. But we should not be afraid to fail. We should take a risk in the process. Visionaries are driven to succeed. For the whole of my ministry, I've been up against people, and the church hierarchy is full of them, who reject a forceful, success-orientated attitude. I believe that people of vision inevitably exhibit an unquenchable need to push to the very limits of what is possible. Far too often, church leadership is complacent. I've heard people say, "Oh no, we'll just keep on doing what we're doing." I call it turning the handle. I've heard people say, "Well, I'm coming up to retirement in 5 years' time, and I haven't really got time to do anything different." For goodness sake, laborers in this vineyard, we're starting now. Think of our forebears, the great visionaries of our history, of all the three churches that came together in the uniting church. They were all zealous in their efforts to get stuff done. And visionaries are team players. Show me a person who tries to do it alone, and I'll show you someone who will cause rather than solve problems. Visionaries surround themselves with the best available people and get things done together. This is why in the church we should be building partnerships with like-minded people in a whole range of different areas. So, here we have a future for our church then, which will need to completely change direction, change behavior, change theology, change bureaucracy. And if the establishment of our church doesn't want to play, then we'll do it here anyway. This will be our midlife transition. The great divinity professor from Harvard, Professor Harvey Cox, said, "We need to embrace the future rather than the past. We need to accept religious pluralism. Whilst there are many faiths or ways of expressing spirituality, there is only one humanity. So whilst we may experience the source of energy differently, we are bound together by our humanity." And the core of understanding of Harvey Cox's approach to the future of faith comes from the firm conviction that the sacred can be experienced in the imminent. The reign of God is not coming. It's already here. It's around us now. So where are we going then? And what does that mean for this church? I'm now talking not about the uniting church. I'm talking about this bit of it, St. Michael's. So when the church grasps hold of this notion, all of a sudden it has life and vigor and energy. We need to ensure that the whole establishment of the church somehow wakes up to that. I believe this church at St. Michael's has got a role to play in that. We can be the church's visionary. We will step into the unknown and continue to declare God's presence in us and the world around us. And we will echo the words of John Wesley. Do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways you can, at all the times you can, to all the people you can, as long as you ever can. And we will do this by breaking down the barriers between religious and secular in the use of our buildings, in the work that we will develop here with Mingery and its spin-offs, in the relationships that we will build with the city, its festivals, its music, its celebration, its joy, its life. We do have a future. And we will use this time of our midlife transition to reframe our tomorrow, to ensure that what we do now will determine a promising, exciting, and joyful tomorrow. And that tomorrow starts now. And we, here in St. Michael's, will be a church open, not closed to the world. And we will do this in the spirit of John Wesley's last words. Best of all, God is with us. And now, go believing that God's Spirit can enable you to be courageous, believing that you can be empowered to ensure a future of courage, of dynamism, of hope and joy, and believing that others will follow in the pursuit of justice and in the practice of caring and peace.